The TYR CXT-FLOW. So 3 things to like with this shoe is number one, I think if you've been looking for that training shoe for a little bit of HIIT, some light lifting, but then also casual wear and short runs that has a wider fit to it, this can be a really good option to go with. So as opposed to some of the other HIIT focused shoes out there like the Adidas ADV2 or the Nike Free Metcon 6, this model does have a slightly wider forefoot for a more anatomical fit. And so if those shoes consecutively feel way too tight for you, this could be a good option to go with. And if you're coming from something like the On Cloud X4 or X3, etc., this will definitely give you way more room regarding upper volume and width. The second thing to like with this shoe is once it breaks in, it does feel pretty good. While the midsole is pretty thick and the stack height is very aggressive in the shoe, I didn't find it super limiting once this model broke in. The midsole does start to move a little bit more and it does start to form fit with your foot a little bit better. But I do have a gripe with it and I'll talk about that in my cons in just a second. The third thing to like with this shoe is if you like the more classic dad style shoes, I do think this shoe kind of fits that ask. And I think if you want that shoe again for wearing out and about casually, this can be one of those training shoes to do so with. And because it's wider, it does have a slightly more comfortable fit. And if you wear it looser, the tongue doesn't really slide too much and it does stay relatively secure. So if you like that dad style looking shoe, this can be a great option. But now let's talk about a couple of cons that I have with this model. So 3 cons that I have with this model is number one, the break-in can be a little bit rough. And now more specifically, I feel like if you generally have boots of shoes aggravate right under that malleolus, so that bony structure on the lateral or medial side of your ankle, this may not be the best option for you. And now this will be a case-by-case basis, but I've noticed that the lateral side of the collar of these shoes, it kind of digs into my lateral malleolus. Now that has broken in, but I do feel it sometimes. And so that said, I think if you have typically a lower structured ankle, and that's often a problem that's annoying for you in training shoes, that could be an issue with the TYR CXT-FLOW. And if you buy them, definitely keep in mind that you may need to return them if you notice a ton of rub there, because obviously you do not want to break the shoe in and then have it just continually rub and you get annoyed and then it's too late to return them. So definitely keep that in mind. I would say if it's more of like a 5 out of 10 pressure, right, as you get these out of the box, you may want to return them. The second con that I have with the shoe is if you have a lower volume foot or a narrow foot, you might find that the upper volume of the shoe is actually just too much. So I love this shoe from a spacious fit and it being great for wider, more high volume, high instep feet. But I think for low volume feet, you might actually find that you swim in this model a little bit, especially with the wider fit up here and the upper volume. I think you might have an issue with upper security when training in this model. The third con that I have with the shoe, and this kind of speaks to that first point, is the midsole itself. So it does break in over time, but this has taken a good solid 2 weeks to get this midsole maneuvering. And so that said, this is not going to be, I think, one of those shoes that you just slap on your feet and it feels good instantly. This is definitely a midsole that's going to need some work. Out of the box, I actually thought these ran relatively stiff, which I was kind of like, holy crap, this is a HIIT-focused shoe. Why is it so stiff? But over time, it has broken in better. And so I do think for most folks, that's not going to be an issue, but don't expect them, in my opinion, to feel perfectly seamless and super flexible out of the box when you first put them on. Not the biggest deal, but definitely something that was a little bit jarring for me because thinking of a HIIT shoe, I was expecting something a little bit more plush, a little bit more pliable, and that was not necessarily the case out of the box with the CXT-FLOW until I was a good like 8 to 10 sessions in with this model. All right, to break down the performance of the CXT-FLOW, I'll discuss how this shoe does for lifting, cross-training, short runs, and daily wear. In the context of lifting, this shoe is about what you'd expect from a HIIT shoe, but I will say the midsole is more dense than models out there like the Cloud X3 or the Rapid Move ADV2 from Adidas. So if you do want a thicker midsole training shoe that's a little bit more supportive for HIIT-focused workouts, and think Hyrox focused workouts or more Metcon style training at your gym, this can be a good option to wear if you like to blend in a little bit of strength work. Now, I would not go crazy heavy in this shoe with the barbell loading. With the higher stack height, you're not going to have as much stability. You also have a pretty aggressive heel bevel and toe spring in the shoe, so obviously stability is going to be capped when you get to certain thresholds. So for heavy back squats, etc., this would not be my go-to shoe. But if you're just doing some general strength work and you're just training with dumbbells, kettlebells, even some light barbell work or upper body days, this model should be okay for those asks. When it comes to cross training, I have liked this shoe for the most part. So to start with the good, the outsole has a nice grip to it. So this rubber tread patterning up here in the forefoot grips really well, especially on turf. So if you like to do a lot of Metcon work on turf, this can be a good option to go with in my opinion. I also like how the heel bevel helps you transition into different movements pretty well. So anything power related, for example, if you're doing plyos and you do have that heel hit first when you're landing, this doesn't completely beat you up, which I appreciate because it is a thicker training shoe. And then I also do like that midsole once it breaks in. Again, once you get past that initial break-in phase, this midsole does start to get a little bit more pliable and a little bit more forgiving. Now, two gripes that I have with this shoe for cross training is number one, this heel collar. Again, I think this could be problematic for some folks, especially with lateral movements. I have noticed this a lot in like my lateral sled drags, especially. I notice it pressing when I'm just wearing it normally, but then when you're really getting lateral into the shoe, you start to get a bit more friction. So that could definitely be a concern, I think, for certain foot anatomies and ankle structures. The second concern that I have with the shoe, and I mentioned this in my cons, is that with the upper volume, you have to crank the shoe tight if you have a lower to mid volume foot. Like I don't have the biggest instep, thickest foot, and so you can see like my laces are exceptionally long when I get the shoe tight to train in them. So definitely food for thought there. If you have a lower volume foot, you might actually want to look for something that actually runs a little bit more narrow, believe it or not, or that has a little bit less space through the upper construction. This is going to be a shoe again for cross training that I think is good for some, but not for all. When it comes to short runs, this model will work for, I think, bouts from 400 to about 1200 meters, maybe even a mile. You can get away with them for that distance and it's going to feel relatively comfortable. Can you run longer in them? Yes. My only concern with that though is that because the upper is a little bit heavier with these overlays and because it's a thicker shoe, it can feel a little bit heavy and clunky. You might just want to look for something that's a little bit more plush, responsive, and lightweight and breathable for running focused asks and workouts. So for example, for a hybrid workout, you might want to look for something a little bit different. For daily wear, I have enjoyed this shoe and I'll wear them a little bit looser for that ask and it makes them a little bit more comfortable too. I have less pressing here with the ankle collar as well in that context. And I will say, I think if you do like the appearance of this shoe and the overlays and how it almost has that like New Balance dad shoe look, then I think this model will hit for you. The colorways are pretty simplistic and they really drive home that dad style fashion. And with the midsole here, I think if you like a slightly more supportive ride with your training shoes and a little bit more foam and a little bit more thickness with your shoes, this can be an awesome option to go with. So for lifting, I would give this shoe a 6.5, 7 out of 10. Again, it's not really optimized for lifting. For cross training, I'd give this shoe an 8 out of 10, 7.5 out of 10. It's good, but I do think there are certain areas where it can start to fall short, and that's more specific to folks' foot anatomies. For short runs, I would give this shoe an 8 out of 10. It can work for intervals and workouts, but again, it can feel a little bit heavy and clunky for longer runs, so definitely find a model that's a little bit more hybrid for that ask. And then for daily wear, I would give the shoe a strong 8.5 out of 10. They have been very comfortable for that context. So when it comes to the price of the CXT-FLOW, you can expect to pay $150. Now, I think if you're buying the shoe for casual workouts and a lot of daily wear, I think that price point can make sense. Now, if you only have money for a single training shoe and you want it for HIIT and also some lifting, you might want to look into other models because $150 isn't the cheapest price point. And if you only have money for one shoe, you might want to find something a little bit more optimized for peak performance versus being a bit more casual in nature with its build. All right, so now let's answer the question, who should buy the CXT-FLOW? Number one, if you like dad style shoes, this can be a good option to go with. Number two, I think if you have been looking for a shoe for HIIT workouts that's a little bit wider, that has a more spacious upper volume, this can be a good option to go with. It kind of reminds me of the Under Armour Commit wide version where there's a lot of room with the upper volume and the overall forefoot width. So this can be a good option, I think, for thicker feet and wider feet who need that style shoe. Number three, I think if you like midsoles in your training shoes to be a bit more supportive and you just want that training shoe for doing a little bit of everything and just being very casual that you can also wear out and about and go for longer walks in, this can also be a great option to go with. Now, who should pass on this shoe? I think if you only have money for one training shoe, you may want to look for something that's a little bit more dialed for lifting and HIIT workouts. Again, the shoe is a little bit more casual with its functionality compared to some of the other models I have reviewed. So for example, if you want that single training shoe for casual wear, but then also lifting and CrossFit and getting heavier with your training, the Hayes trainer can be awesome. If you want a shoe for lifting and CrossFit, the CXT2 trainer can be great for that. It's gonna be a little bit more dialed for that as well. The Rad V2 can be an awesome option. And then if you want something specifically for HIIT workouts, this can be a good option, but if you like a little bit more flexibility and ground feel, you might wanna look into something like the Innovate F-Lite or the Rapid Move V2, not the AD V2 from Adidas. Another context where I think this shoe doesn't make a lot of sense is if you have a low volume foot and a narrow foot. I just think this shoe is gonna feel a little bit too big on you and you might find that you're swimming in them. So definitely keep that in mind if you fall into that foot anatomy. When it comes to sizing and fit of the CXT-FLOW, so this is a size 10. I wear a size 10 in all of my shoes. And just to give you context here, because the CXT2 can run a little bit short at times, the CXT-FLOW runs very similar with its length, but I think because the upper volume is a little bit more spacious and it's a wider shoe, even though my CXT2 trainer is wide here, it just has a more spacious fit to it. So I don't know if you're gonna have to size up in the shoe, and true to size should be the call, I think, for most individuals. But when it comes to foot widths and what you should do with your sizing, I think if you have a narrow foot, you should be safe going true to size. But again, keep in mind that this model might actually be a little bit too spacious for you. For medium width feet, true to size will be the call. And then for wider feet, so E to 2E widths, true to size should be the call. And then if you have a 3E width and you want to hedge your bets, going up a half size can be a safe bet in this option. And if you have a flatter foot, this model will have a little bit of arch, but it's not super aggressive. But definitely keep in mind that if you have a flatter foot, you may also need to return these if that arch really irks you, because it can be so variable depending on what your preferences are if you have a flat foot. So toe box comparison of the Nike Free Metcon 6 versus the TYR CXT-FLOW versus the Adidas Rapid Move ADV2. You can see that the CXT-FLOW has the wider forefoot and the more spacious upper as well. Like, there's just a bit more room in this shoe. It's a bit more chonky compared to these shoes that are a little bit more hugging of the midfoot and have slightly more aggressive tapers here through the forefoot. So when it comes to the weight, heel, toe drop, and insole in the TYR CXT-FLOW, for my size 10 shoe here, we have a weight of 14.30 ounces. This is a chonker. The heel to toe drop of the shoe sits at 4 millimeters, and this model does have a thin foam removable insole. So if you have your custom orthotics and you need a shoe with a bit more space, again, this can be a really good option to go with in my opinion. All right, when discussing the construction of the TYR CXT-FLOW, up here on the toe box, we have a synthetic overlay that wraps over the toe. It is pretty aggressive, so I do think you're gonna get a nice level of security in this once you can get this midfoot tight enough for your needs. And if you're a wider foot, this should help prevent any spillover in my opinion. You have mesh here that runs through the forefoot and through the midfoot on the lateral and medial side of the shoe. And then you have these synthetic textile overlays that cover the midfoot and then wrap into the heel. You have some TYR branding here on the lateral heel, and you also have an external heel tab as well. On the medial heel, you also have a little bit of TYR branding. Looking at the midfoot, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 eyelets that go up, and you have a tongue that has an additional loop. Now, there is no gusset in this tongue, but the way it sits and the way it's thicker and it's mesh, it doesn't really move a ton when you're training, especially if you get the laces tight enough. Again, though, if you have a narrower foot or a medium width foot, expect these laces to run plenty long for your needs, because you're gonna have to crank this midfoot tighter, in my opinion. Looking at the midsole, you have a medium density midsole that runs throughout the entirety of the shoe, an extended outsole layer on the toe box up here, and then you also have a little bit of an outsole overlay here on the lateral and medial side. Looking at the outsole of the shoe, you have a full rubber tread with these grooves that run throughout. Up here in the forefoot, you do have some breaks for additional flexibility, and you do have a wider forefoot as well. This model, once again, does have a thin foam removable insole, but if you have additional questions on this shoe's construction, drop a comment down below. All right, so let's answer the question. Would I get this shoe again? Probably not, and there are two reasons for that. It's not because it's not necessarily a good casual shoe for training, but for me personally, I think the heel collar is a little bit too big for my anatomy. I think it will work for some, but I think for lower malleolus, lower structured ankles, this might be a little bit aggressive for you. You're gonna get a little bit more rub. And also number two, it's just a little bit too spacious, honestly, for me. I have to crank this tight to get them secure when training. And honestly, I like having a shoe for HIIT that's a little bit more pliable and athletic or sock-like feeling on my foot. And again, I think it's a decent shoe, but it's not a shoe for everyone. And if you have additional questions on this model and if you should pick it up, drop a comment down below or reach out to me personally, whichever you prefer. And as always, y'all, drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel. I will see you guys in the next one.